I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us on Zoom. I'm Gloria Palmer. I'm the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. Let me just say this, I'm really happy to see all of you here. I had a moment of reflection this morning. It's been 6 months that we've been in this new virtual reality, and I realized how very different this way of programming is. A good part of our programming in the past has been a coming together, connecting socially with a common interest in the topic at hand. So to say I miss this kind of connection, the face-to-face conversations or a handshake or even a hug with a greeting is an understatement. We are, however, managing quite well, and I'm grateful that you have stuck with us. Earlier today, as I was watching a flurry of registrations come in for this program as well as for others, some people were leaving comments about thanks for the programs that we're offering, and also stating how timely and important it is to understand the times that we are in. I am emotionally gratified when I read that, and it tells me that we're doing something right. My thoughts have run the gamut these past 6 months from, oh God, how are we going to stay afloat, to, yes, we knocked it out of the park. So thank you. Thank you for being with us here. Thank you for continuing to register with us. Thank you for your donations that have always been an essential part of our budget. Thank you for seeing the value in what we offer the community, and thank you for making a difference. Today's presenter is Steven Sodergren. He has taught in the History and Political Science Department at Norwich University since 2007. He currently serves as chair of that department. As the resident Civil War scholar at Norwich, he routinely teaches courses on that subject in addition to a variety of courses on American and military history. Each summer, he leads a group of Norwich students on staff rides to a range of Civil War battlefields. However, I wonder if you've done that this summer. He completed his first book, The Army of the Potomac in the Overland and Petersburg Campaigns, Union Soldiers and Trench Warfare, 1864 to 65, which was published by Louisiana State University Press in June of 2017. Sodergren won the 2018 Colby Award, the first author associated with Norwich University to win the prize in their 20-year history. It is a true pleasure to have you back with us. Thank you, Stephen, for being our guest today.
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you to the Green Mountain Academy for having me back for another presentation. I'm always happy to step out and, share my experiences, share some of the things I've learned with the wider audience. And that's what I'm hoping to do today. My goal today is to address something that is perhaps surprisingly still controversial to us to this day, and that is why the Civil War? Why did this conflict happen? We are seeing the ramifications of the Civil War on our, breaking out in our streets. With commentary and protests surrounding statues, protesting concerns over the naming of everything from schools to military bases. So the Civil War is still with us. And I'm happy to address some of these issues. I'm happy to offer some commentary on those issues, but my goal today is really just to talk about why did it happen. So I want to move back into the past and ask some of the people who started it what their thinking was and what their motivations were. Just a warning, I will be quoting extensively from several participants in the war, and their language is outdated, in particular of their descriptions of African Americans, and so some of the terms I use may be deemed offensive. So what I'd like to do now is I do have a slide presentation that I wanted to start us off with. And this will just highlight some of the main points, offer some of the quotes that I'll be reading as we go, and also some images. And so what I want to do today is I want to start with the start of the war. And the start of the war happened right here on April 12th, 1861, with the bombardment of Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. But this is commonly used to describe how the war began, but it doesn't really explain why the war happened. Ultimately, we have to explain how it got to the point where the people of Charleston, where the people of South Carolina were willing to open fire on the American military personnel stationed in their harbor. We have to understand why a conflict, a fratricidal conflict, actually began. And so to do that, we have to go back about 6 months prior to this event, and we have to turn to a presidential election, in fact. It's probably not something that we want to hear these days, but a presidential election led to some of the greatest turmoil and dissension that our country has ever seen. And it was the election of 1860 that really set off the Civil War and crossed a point of no return. So let's take a look at the election real quick here. It's a strange election when you look at it. There were 4 major candidates, of which Abraham Lincoln was only one. And really what we see here is a fracturing of the American political system. What we see in the 1860 presidential election is a failure of our political system. We had already broken up into a bipartisan dynamic. The Republicans and the Democrats existed in 1860, but not the Republicans and Democrats that you know. The Republican and Democratic parties were really in more of their infant form at this point. In fact, the Republican Party had only been in existence for about 5 years by this point. And as a result, these parties don't really look like what we have today. In fact, the Republicans were based in the North and had more liberal political views, and the Democrats were based in the South and had more conservative political views. So these really aren't the parties that we live with today. And that partially explains why things fall apart in 1860. Abraham Lincoln is nominated as the Republican nominee for the presidency, but the Democrats can't decide who they want. There are Northern Democrats and there are Southern Democrats, and the Northern Democrats decide that they're going to go with tried and true favorite and the person who's beaten Lincoln before, Stephen A. Douglas from Illinois. But the Southern Democrats don't agree. They don't trust Stephen Douglas. They don't trust a Northerner. They don't trust his waffling on the issue of slavery and states' rights. So they go with John C. Breckinridge, former Vice President of the United States and a good diehard states' rights Southerner. A third party, or fourth party, however you want to see it, breaks out as well, with people basically washing their hands of both the Republicans and the Democrats and saying, look, the country's falling apart, we just need unity, and they rally around this gentleman, John Bell. The result is a 4-way split. Really, if the Democrats had stuck together, they probably could have won the election, but by splitting, they hand the vote over to the Republicans. Now let's take a look at these numbers real quick, because Abraham Lincoln unequivocally wins the electoral vote. And as you know, in this country, the popular vote is not nearly as relevant as the electoral vote. Lincoln wins the election. But look at his percentage of the popular vote, 39.8%. Lincoln was and remains to this day one of the most unpopular presidents this country has ever had because of the number of people who voted for him. He wins. 60% of the voters didn't vote for Abraham Lincoln as president. They voted for somebody else, not the same person, but somebody else. So right away, this is a sign of trouble. The Lincoln presidency is in trouble from almost day one. And that's what happens. Within 6 weeks of Lincoln being elected president, the first state, South Carolina, secedes. 7 states will secede from the Union before he's even inaugurated president. He is inaugurated on March 6, 1861, and by that point, a quarter of the country has already left. We'll get into their reasons here in just a moment, but Lincoln, if you read his address, it's not one of his better speeches. His second inaugural is the more famous. He almost doesn't really seem to understand what's happened. He doesn't understand why people hate him so. But by this point, remember, 7 states secede before Lincoln even takes office, before he has any power to do anything. And he doesn't quite get it. And so in his inaugural address, Lincoln says this. He directly addresses the states that seceded, and he says, "Before entering upon so grave a matter as the destruction of our national fabric with all its benefits, its memories, and its hopes, would it not be wise to ascertain precisely why we do it? Will you hazard so desperate a step while there is any possibility that any portion of the ills you fly from have no real existence?" He's trying to say to the people of the South, I don't think your problems are as bad as all that. I don't think they justify this egregious step of actually removing yourselves from the Union. Well, it is too late by that point. Lincoln's address it's not even printed in the newspapers in the South. So he's mostly just speaking to the audience that you see pictured here. But it's this moment that we begin to see the country truly crossing the Rubicon, so to speak, and crossing the point of no return. 7 states secede before Lincoln becomes president. 4 more, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, will secede after Fort Sumter. They choose, when it actually comes to blows, they choose the southern side. Why? Well, that's why we're here. And people like to simplify this question. People like to make it an either or prospect. People like to say it's slavery. People like to say it's states' rights. Well, unfortunately, the answer I have for you today is yes to both. Unfortunately, I have to say that there really is no single answer, no tidy soundbite that enunciates why this happened. It was the culmination of all of American history to that point. It was cultural, it was social, it was economic, it was political, it was racial. And the result of it led to the deaths of over 700,000 Americans. So I think to try to simplify it is an injustice and doesn't do justice to the people who fought and died in it. So my goal for today is to actually answer 2 separate questions as best as I am able. Why did the war happen? Why did it happen? And for that explanation, you have to look at politics. You have to look at the notion of secession itself. But a second question I think is more difficult. Why did men fight in it? Why did people willingly sacrifice their lives in it? And you're going to find that the answers to these might be related, but aren't necessarily the same thing. So let's begin and let's try to break down secession. Why secession? Why Lincoln doesn't understand, Lincoln doesn't think that they have justifiable reasons for seceding. So maybe we should ask the states themselves, why did they do it? How do you justify secession? Well, a couple notes on secession before we get into the justifications here. This is a breakdown of which states left and when. South Carolina goes first, North Carolina goes last. The deep South, so to speak, the 7 states of the deep South, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, they all go first. Now, the process of secession was interesting. It was somewhat democratic. People voted. Each county effectively voted for a delegate to send to the state convention. By selecting a delegate, they would either select a delegate who was pro-secession or anti-secession. This map shows that that voting was a bit more complicated than you might think. This map shows that the green areas are the ones that said yes, pro-secession, absolutely. Look at South Carolina, solid green. The pink areas represent counties that sent people who were supposed to be opposed to secession, that resisted secession. Look at this, Western Virginia, Eastern Tennessee, Alabama, all over Georgia. There was tremendous opposition to secession in the South. Let me put it this way, Georgia. The vote in Georgia is split. If you count up the people who voted for pro-secession delegates and count up the people who voted for anti-secession delegates, 44,152 votes for pro, 41,632 for anti. Let me put it this way, 51.5% voted to secede, 48.5% voted to not secede. That's close. That is not the people of Georgia standing up united and going, we must leave the Union. North Carolina, you look at this map and you go, oh, wow, they must have been devoted to secession. They must have been universally supportive of it. They were after Fort Sumter. In February, before Fort Sumter, they vote 3-1 against secession. They hold another secession convention after Fort Sumter and then vote to secede. So they had already tried it and the people didn't have it. It was only when war breaks out that they have to choose sides, they choose South. So this is not a one-sided issue. This is not an easy issue. You can't look at the Confederacy as a monolithic body universally saying we are leaving the country. There was no unanimity. There was no unanimity in the South any more than there was in the North. There was resistance, and this would make itself apparent over the course of the war. But really, when it comes down to secession, we are looking at the people who did decide. Those delegates that the people were voting on, they meet in the state capitals and they discuss secession. And so at some point, they have to come up with a legal explanation as to why they're leaving. Keep in mind, these are wealthier, more educated people, a lot of lawyers, and they are going to not do this on a whim. They're going to do this with a clear stated justification. And that clear stated justification were the ordinances of secession. All 11 states put down in an official document their explanation as to why they were leaving the Union. And there's a lot of issues in these. Some are really long. South Carolina's is several pages. Florida is about a paragraph. But they all touch upon major issues. And there's really two big issues that are inescapable when you read the ordinances of secession. Slavery is at the top of the list. According to the secession conventions, all of them mention slavery in some way or another. And most of them make it the preeminent issue that is leading to their secession. If you are looking at the stated reasons why the states seceded and why the Civil War happened, it's slavery. It's inescapable. South Carolina notes, 14 of the states have deliberately refused for the past years to fulfill their constitutional obligations. What 14 states are they referring to? All the non-slave states. And they reached the conclusion that a geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states north of that line have united in the election of a man to the high office of the President of the United States, whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. So they basically equate slavery and politics there. They basically say Abraham Lincoln is hostile to slavery. The North supports Abraham Lincoln. Therefore, they're hostile to slavery. Therefore, we cannot participate in this anymore. Mississippi is the one that really probably talks about slavery the most. Mississippi, the second line in their Declaration of Secession, the first one is, we are basically seceding from the Union. The second one is, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. Texas. Texas doesn't talk that much about slavery, but it does provide a brief history of its participation in the Union, and it says the state willingly joined the Union. They point out that they had been an independent republic before joining the Union. The state joined the Union as a commonwealth holding, maintaining, and protecting the institution known as Negro slavery. So they're all talking about slavery. And it's not just the conventions. You look at the major figures involved in the birth of the Confederacy, and they're all talking about it too. They all reference it in some way as being a causal factor for the war. Henry Benning was a state Supreme Court justice from Georgia, and he actually is a big supporter of secession, so much so that he goes, after Georgia secedes, he goes up to Virginia and tries to convince the Virginians to also secede. And in a speech to their secession convention, he says that Abraham Lincoln's election essentially means the end of white supremacy and the rise of a black majority. The black race, as he says, will be in a large majority, and then we will have black governors, black legislators, black juries, black everything. Henry Benning will go on to become a Confederate general. Fort Benning, Georgia is named after him. Alexander Stephens, he gets the finger pointed at him a lot. He's the one who gives a speech. He's the vice president of the Confederacy, and he gives a speech right after being elected vice president of the Confederacy, where he says that the Confederacy was a revolution, and the Confederacy's foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, speaking as the vice president of the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis and his resignation from the U.S. Senate. Jefferson Davis was senator from Mississippi when the war breaks out. And on January 21st, 1861, he resigns from the Senate, saying, "My state seceded, I'm going with it." And in it, he gives a speech where he basically says Mississippi's justified, and he says that slavery needs to be protected. He believes that all men are created equal, does not apply to the black race. And he states, "Slavery was established by decree of Almighty God. It is sanctioned in the Bible, both testaments, from Genesis to Revelation." So you cannot escape this discussion of slavery when you look at the article, when you look at the ordinances of secessions. But that's not all they're saying. They're saying a lot more, because this is more than just slavery. There are other issues at stake here. Principles, political principles. And so when it comes to justifying secession, the reason why they're seceding is slavery, but why they're able to secede and why it's necessary for them to secede is political. After Lincoln's elected president, Congress goes into compromise mode. This is what had always solved the problem before. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise. In 1850, the Compromise of 1850. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Compromise had always solved the problem before. And Congress just thinks they'll do it again. So in December of 1860, right before South Carolina secedes, Congress does a Hail Mary. And they propose an unamendable amendment. The 13th Amendment would have been, if approved, an amendment guaranteeing slavery forever. And with language that said that basically this is an unamendable amendment and can never be altered. Not sure something like that is actually legal, but that's what they proposed. Congress said they would pass it. Even Lincoln said he'd consider supporting it. The Southerners walk away anyway. Their response to it, the Southern representatives to Congress release a joint statement where they reject the amendment. And they state, "The argument is exhausted. All hope of relief in the Union through the agency of committees, congressional legislation, or constitutional amendments is extinguished." And this statement gets to the heart of what's really behind secession, and that is a lack of faith in government. A lack of faith in the government being responsive to their needs and protective of what they consider their rights. And one of their rights that they see is owning slaves. So you really can't divorce the two. But the political principle behind this is a lack of faith in governmental process. And you see that in South Carolina, going back to their Declaration of Secession. Lincoln's election means the guarantees of the Constitution will then no longer exist. The equal rights of the states will be lost. The slaveholding states will no longer have the power of self-government or self-protection. So they're singling out Lincoln, as most of them do. They mostly single out Lincoln and say that he won't respect the Constitution. So we can't stay in this country under the leadership of a man who will not respect the Constitution. Texas, I love, Texas, unsurprisingly, is a bit more blunt. Texas and their ordinances of secession states, secession is due to the disloyalty of the northern states and their citizens and the imbecility of the federal government. So once again, Texas is essentially saying that the failures of the federal government, the inability of it to represent its people properly, that's what's led to this event, and that's why secession is necessary. And once again, going back to these same political figures, they're saying similar things. The governor of South Carolina, the vice president of the Confederacy, president of the Confederacy, they're all basically saying the same thing. The government has failed us. We have to go and form our own. Governor Francis Pickens of South Carolina. We must start our government free from the vulgar influences that have debauched and demoralized our government in Washington. They see Washington as being aloof, disconnected from the needs of the people. And so they're going to go off and form their own government. Alexander Stephens, who always found a way to link things back to slavery and race. Alexander Stephens described it as a conflict between the friends of constitutional liberty versus the demon of centralism, abolition, and despotism. And Jefferson Davis, once again, in his resignation from the Senate in January of 1861, he says that Mississippi is completely justified in seceding because Mississippi's safety requires that she should provide for the maintenance of her own rights out of the Union. The only way to protect their rights was to remove themselves from the Union. So, at the heart of all of this, there are these political principles. And if you look at the nation that the Confederates form, it's interesting that their Constitution is the American Constitution. They basically carbon copy the American Constitution. They tweak it. They make some tweaks to it. For one thing, slavery is guaranteed forever. The president gets a 6-year term, not a 4-year term. They institute a line item veto for the president as well. And they do a few other tweaks and things like that. But basically the fact that they take the US Constitution almost in full suggests that they haven't lost faith in the Constitution. They've lost faith in the people implementing the Constitution, namely Abraham Lincoln. But we have to be careful because who are these people? These are the very elites that in some ways they are decrying. These are these are rich people. Jefferson Davis was one of the wealthiest people in Mississippi. He owned about 1/10 of the state. These were very wealthy. They were plantation owners. They were lawyers. They were all sorts of major figures. They were not the average person. And if you know anything about warfare, it's typically the average person who's going to be the boots on the ground. So the war happened because of men like this, because of the decisions they made. But why people fought in the Civil War, that's a bit more of a complicated story. Let's look at why the soldiers fought, because, you look at pictures like this and you see it. These guys aren't senior statesmen. They are not, they do not have years of wisdom under their belt. They are my students at Norwich. They are 18 to 22-year-olds, even younger. They're at the dawn of adulthood, and they're making major decisions. And this is the one thing we need to remember right off the bat. 90% of the soldiers who served in the American Civil War, 90% were volunteers. The draft was instituted late and with an irregular quality to it. The overwhelming majority of soldiers who were there chose to be there. Even in the 20th century, even with conflicts like World War I and World War II, you see large chunks of draftees involved, certainly with things like the Vietnam War. More recently, we have an all-volunteer force. That changes things. But in the Civil War, close to 4 million men served in uniform, and over 3.5 million of them chose to be there. So it's important to look at the choices they made and why they said they were there. But that's difficult. How do you distill 3.5 million decisions down to a 45 to 60-minute presentation? It's impossible. And what's made all the more difficult is that all of these men, they had different decisions, and they didn't always leave a record behind. Really, of those men who served, we really only have written records of about 1 million of them. We have service records. We know that on this day they joined, on this day they fought, on this day they left. But they didn't ask on your enlistment papers why you were there. They asked where you were from, how tall were you, the color of your hair and your eye color, various other personal data, not why are you fighting. So instead we have to dig deeper. And by digging deeper, we begin to see the beauty that is the American soldier and how individual they are and how different they were from one another. Unfortunately, that poses a problem for us. trying to reach conclusions, trying to identify trends, trying to understand themes in 3.5 to 4 million individual decisions. So let's look at some individuals. And let's actually start at the top. We'll get to the guys in the ranks here in a bit, but let's start at the top and let's look at two men. Two people you've probably never heard of, yet two people who were tremendously important to their respective causes. General Joseph Holt and General Samuel Cooper. It's interesting because these gentlemen make decisions in fighting in the war that don't really line up with what you think they would have done. Joseph Holt, from Kentucky, landowner in Kentucky, does not own slaves, but has many family members in Kentucky who do own slaves, and he has no opposition to slavery. In fact, he supports it. When asked whether or not he supports emancipation, he says, he does not say African Americans, but he says African Americans are unprepared for freedom as they ever will be. Not a big fan. When the war breaks out, seems like this is the kind of guy who would join the South. Nope, he supports the Union. He is actually a trained lawyer, and Abraham Lincoln will select him to be the judge advocate general for the Union Army, essentially the chief law enforcement, or chief judge for the Army during the war. Why does he go north? Why does he do this when he has really a vested interest in things like slavery, but also he has friends in the South? Well, as he says, secession will lead to ruin. It will lead to national weakness, standing armies, incessant wars, and expensive frontier fortifications. For Joseph Holt, it wasn't about slavery. It wasn't even really about politics. It was about the future. The country will only survive as a united entity. Secession will tear us apart, and we will be fighting each other forever. Samuel Cooper. Samuel Cooper was from New Jersey. Born and raised, he had actually gone to West Point. He had served in the Army before the war. So he was an Army officer who had taken an oath to protect and defend the United States of America and the Constitution of the United States. He had expressed hesitation about slavery, but had never really directly commented on it. But you wouldn't think of it, but he does actually go south. He's good friends. In the Army, he meets a young man by the name of Jefferson Davis. He meets another young man, well, not young, but another man by the name of Robert E. Lee. And he eventually develops friends with many Southern-born officers. And when Lincoln's election occurs, he's asked whether or not he will support the North or the South, and he declares, "My sympathies are all with the Southern cause." And when the war breaks out, he resigns his commission in the U.S. Army and goes south. And interestingly enough, Samuel Cooper, friends of Jefferson Davis, will be appointed Judge Advocate General for the Confederate Army. You are looking at the two Judge Advocate Generals of the respective opponents during the war. What's even more interesting about Samuel Cooper is that he gets promoted to full general first. He's really good friends with Jefferson Davis. Who's promoted to full general after him? Robert E. Lee. General Samuel Cooper, born and raised in New Jersey, Confederate officer, outranks Robert E. Lee for the duration of the war. Two people that kind of belie an easy explanation as to why they make the choices that they did. And this just goes to show that we can't really reduce it down to broad themes, that particularly when it comes to why soldiers fought, it's a very complex issue. So what I'm about to do is reduce it down to some themes, but I do that in the sense of just trying to give some guidance. And I want to make clear that this is not exhaustive and that you can study the Civil War soldier for your entire life and still only scratch the surface of why they were fighting. So why did they fight? Well, let's be cynical first and start with personal interest. Following the 20th century, we tend, if you look at 20th century conflicts and Americans in 20th century conflicts, you see a certain cynical take on things. I'm a big fan of the writings of Ernie Pyle from World War II. And as he's walking around interviewing soldiers in the ETO, Italy, and eventually out in the Pacific, he adopts, I don't know if I want to say cynical, but a very pragmatic view of soldiers. He does not see them there fighting to avenge Pearl Harbor. He does not see them there fighting to uphold the four freedoms. He tends to see combat soldiers as there because it's a job and they got to do it, and then they can go home. But he also sees other reasons, and that is, and what this gets to is a sense of personal interest, personal survival, but also personal advancement. In the Civil War, you have soldiers who joined up. Remember, 90% volunteers. I want to keep coming back to that. 90% of them were volunteers. They joined up for a variety of reasons, and some of it could have been as basic as the Army offered a job. It offered money. It was an unstable time. And particularly if you're getting off a boat from a foreign country with nothing but a carpet bag in your hand, the idea of $13 a month and 3 square meals a day was pretty attractive. The Confederacy, $11 a month and 3 square meals a day. And we shouldn't overlook the possibility that a lot of these guys did it because it offered them a career path. It offered them money. Sometimes a lot of money. Particularly individual states. States were under quotas. They had to get a certain number of volunteers. So if the volunteers aren't coming, you have to encourage them. And one way to do it is with money, the bonus. States offered $300, $400, $500, $600 in then money, multiply it by about a factor of 30 today, to sign up. $300, you get half up front, you get the other half when you complete your service. $300. $13 a month, that's more than 2 years' pay right there. Actually, I have an ancestor. My great-great-grandfather from Missouri, Amos Augustus Wickersham Fritchie. You got to love that name. He was in Missouri. He walked 200 miles to enlist in an Illinois regiment in Carbondale, Illinois. Why? Well, he could have enlisted in a regiment in Missouri. Yeah, Missouri didn't have bonuses. Illinois did. He wanted the $300, and he got it. He also got wounded but survived the war, actually. So we shouldn't ignore the fact that there might be some more basic elements here. And there's other personal interests that you can find here, psychological reasons, peer pressure. You're looking at a picture of the 2nd Vermont Infantry Regiment at Camp Griffin. That's basically Langley, Virginia, in 1861. All the state regiments were formed from local groups. Vermonters here, the 2nd Vermont, these guys were from Rutland. They were from Manchester. They were from Barrie. They were from Montpelier. They were from Burlington. And typically, a regiment was broken up into 10 companies. Each company would have 100 men. So 100 men from Rutland form a company. They would join up the 2nd Vermont. Well, odds are those men knew each other. It was a very local affair at the time. So you are in a regiment with your brother, your father, your cousin, your neighbor, your doctor, your preacher, your mayor. Who wants to be the guy who doesn't go? Who wants to be the guy who the entire town is going off to fight for their country, whether it's North or South, and they don't go? Peer pressure. The idea of women presenting the white feather to soldiers is more of a European thing, but it did occur. And so there was this notion that if I don't go, I'm going to be the only one who doesn't, and I have to do this. So peer pressure, personal interest, I think these were factors that were there, but I'm not sure they were the primary factors. Believe it or not, these guys were fighting for things they believed in. Once again, I think we live in a more cynical age these days, but it's often easy for us to forget that people in the 19th century typically said things that they believed and believed things that they said. That patriotism wasn't a joke to them. That notions of duty and honor weren't throwaway terms to them. I do believe that a lot of soldiers fought because they believed they were doing the right thing for their country. Well, what's their country? Let's break this down one country at a time, shall we? Start with the North. Northerners instantly have it a little bit easier because their country is easily identifiable. It's in Washington, D.C. It follows the United States Constitution, which was written by James Madison and approved by the Constitutional Convention in 1787. They follow the Stars and Stripes, the flag that in some form has been present for 80-odd years. But they definitely connect their service to the revolution. They're trying to protect what the revolution created. So William Stewart from Missouri, we fight for the blessings bought by the blood and treasure of our fathers, capital F. I will fight till I die if necessary for the liberties we have so long enjoyed. They're trying to save the country. Why save the country? Patriotism. Joseph Scroggs, the Union is the best government that ever existed. Absolutely, unequivocally. They believe that they are saving this country. And there's also this American notion that goes all the way back to the city on the hill mentality of the Puritans, the idea that we're the best country in the world and we're the last best hope. W.D. Wildman from Indiana, the Union is not only the citadel for our liberty, but the depository of the hopes of the human race. When they put it in terms like that, the question becomes less, why did they fight, than why would they even consider not fighting? They are fighting for the future of the country and for the future of the human race. So these men genuinely, at least in 1861, that's an important caveat, when they first sign on, when they first willingly volunteer, they wrap themselves in the American flag. They wrap themselves in notions of founding fathers and revolutionaries. And they go out there to save their country. So how do we explain the Confederates? Well, in their eyes, they're saving the country too. And the Confederates, just as vehemently, are going to articulate patriotic and principled arguments as to why they need to serve, why they need to join up. It's a bit more difficult because they are declaring their independence, but they don't see it that way. In fact, they believe that they're the ones that's saving the country. They're the ones that's saving the American Revolution from being destroyed. William Prophet from North Carolina, let us compare our situation and cause to those of our illustrious ancestors who achieved the liberties we have ever enjoyed, for which we are now contending. They are saving the country once again. They are saving it from aggression. In many ways, and many of these guys will equate Abraham Lincoln with King George, the Republican Party with Parliament. They will see that as, in some ways, a continuation of the revolution. They are fighting against a tyranny. So in some ways, they are articulating the same ideas that the secession conventionists did, but in a more kind of localized idea. And localized is the key thing that we're talking about. William Coleman, Kentucky, sink or swim, survive or perish, I will fight in defense of my country. And when he's saying country, he's referring to the state of Kentucky. How is Kentucky a country? Well, it's everything to him. We live in an era where you can't turn around without tripping over a federal government. We see the federal government not just in our televisions and on our internet, but in some form in our daily lives. The federal government had not reached that point in 1860. The only time your average citizen saw the federal government was when the mail was delivered. Apart from that, there was no real representation of federal authority, particularly in rural states like Kentucky and Tennessee. Who did you see a lot more of? The state and the community. You saw your mayors, you saw your councilmen, you saw your state legislature. You'd maybe see the governor come through an election tour. You'd never see Abraham Lincoln. You'd never see Franklin Pierce. These were not people you had touch with in your daily life. So to many of these guys, they saw their state as their country. Thomas Gorey of Texas, it is better to spend our all defending our country, he's referring to Texas, than to be subjugated and have it taken away from us. They identified their country with their state. Robert E. Lee says something very similar when he resigns his commission and goes south. It's like, I cannot raise hands against my country. He's referring to Virginia. So you see here just a different notion of patriotism. They both think they're saving, both Northerners and Southerners think they are saving the country. And this is hard for us to understand today when we have such a different notion of the United States. And part of that notion we have is because of the Civil War and its outcome. But the federal government was a much more abstract concept to them. And they had a much more immediate connection with the state governments. So I want to say, and I want to make clear that this does not apply to all soldiers, but certainly patriotism, principle, duty, honor, obligation to serve. These, I think, are what were the main driving factors behind soldiers choosing to fight in the war. But let's address this notion of slavery one more time here, because it comes up. And that's the important thing. The guys at the top, the guys in the Secession Convention, the Jefferson Davises, they're talking about slavery a lot. Abraham Lincoln's talking about slavery or not. The soldiers, not so much. The soldiers do not talk about slavery all that much, but they do talk about it. And so I think it's worth discussing how they are reacting to slavery. Some of them fought because of slavery. Absolutely. You can find examples of it. But what's interesting is for Northerners, looking at just the North, in 1861, very few soldiers are talking about slavery. They're talking about duty, they're talking about saving the country, they're talking about the founding fathers. Very few of them are talking about slavery. 2 years later, a lot of them are talking about slavery. What's changed? They've seen it. Your average Union soldier does not know what a slave is. Your average farm boy from New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, they've never seen a slave. They may have seen an African American, but they've never seen a slave. They don't know what it is. And then they're put in the army and they're sent to Virginia, Louisiana, Alabama, North Carolina, and they see slavery. And it disgusts them. Cyrus Boyd, member of the 15th Iowa, he's in Tennessee with the Army in 1862, and he sees a child slave being sold at an auction, and it disgusts him. And he goes to his diary and he writes a lengthy entry where he denounces slavery. And he says, "This is why I'm fighting now. By God, I'll fight till hell freezes over, and then I'll cut the ice and fight on." Almost overnight, the war becomes about slavery for him. And this is what happens. More and more soldiers see it. And as a result, they disgusted by it. And they want to do something about it. An unidentified Wisconsin soldier, it was a donated diary from a soldier who we know served in a Wisconsin unit, but we don't have a name for him. The rebellion is abolitionizing the whole army. Men of all parties seem unanimous in the belief that to permanently establish the Union is to first wipe out the institution. Very few soldiers talking about slavery in 1861. They're not all talking about it in 1863, but more of them are talking about it in 1863, and partly because Lincoln's making them. By 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation is passed. By 1863, soldiers are supposed to free slaves when they come across them. So whether they want to talk about it or not, it's now part of their job description. Abolition. And as a result, historian Chandra Manning, she wrote a great book about why soldiers fought and issues with slavery called What This Cruel War Was Over. And I mean, she makes a good point that in many ways, as the soldiers begin to see slavery, they in some ways drive emancipation. She says the enlisted men in the Union Army forged the crucial link between slaves and policymakers. In other words, they see slavery, they communicate it to the people back home, it filters up through the political system to the congressmen who begin to do something about ending slavery. So although soldiers may not be fighting because of slavery to begin with in the North, by 1863-64, a lot more of them are. Just the opposite for the Confederates. In 1861, a lot of them are talking about slavery, trickles off to almost disappears over the course of the war. Very few Confederate soldiers talk about slavery, it's because very few Confederate soldiers owned slaves. Soldiers, officers, a lot of them did. Close to 40% of Confederate officers owned or had owned slaves in their life. Enlisted men, it's under 5%. So your average private really doesn't have anything invested in slavery. But officers like Elias Davis from Alabama states in 1861, "I will fight forever rather than submit to freeing Negroes among us." Many other officers share this. And when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, you have officers saying, you have Officer Captain John Welsh from Virginia noting, "After Lincoln's proclamation, any man that would not fight to the last ought to be hung." That's the officers. And they talk about they talk about slavery, but that disappears over the course of the war. One thing that does increase among enlisted men is they are talking about slavery, but not racial slavery. Enlisted Confederate soldiers talk about slavery a lot, their own. Talk about their own subjugation. Enlisted men, and this ties back into the political principles, this talks in about the local identity, believe that if the Union wins, if Lincoln wins, they will lose their rights. And who doesn't have rights? A slave. John Fane, a Confederate private from North Carolina, writes repeatedly how he's worried that he and his friends would choose to die rather than be slaves. We've seen previous quotes about fear of subjugation. Southern white men frequently compared themselves to slaves when talking about why they fought. I am fighting to save myself from slavery. I'm not fighting for slaves or against slaves. I'm trying to save my rights, because if I lose my rights, I'm nothing more than a slave. So really, when you read, if you just do, and this is the difficulty of really internet times, some of my students, they do research on Civil War and they just do like a Google search for slavery, and well, okay, slave pops up in Confederate soldiers' letters all the time, but not necessarily in the context you think. They are talking about slavery, just in a different manner. So what's interesting is that, once again, going back to Chandra Manning, she notes that slavery, she says, slavery served as the cement that held Confederates together even under the almost impossibly trying circumstances. Yes, slavery, not necessarily racial slavery. Slavery as a concept was huge in the Confederate Army, but rarely was it utilized in direct reference to African Americans. It was more fear of the Southern population being enslaved. So what conclusions can we draw from all of this? I just got to reiterate one more time that these are merely broad trends. These are merely differing conclusions. And also, you can't look at the war as a single monolithic entity. The War of 1861 was nothing like the War of 1865. And I will be the first one to say that the reasons why men chose to fight are not the same as to why men actually crossed the battlefield. And the reason why soldiers were still fighting in 1865, they weren't talking about duty, honor, and patriotism in 1865. They were more talking about the Ernie Pyle notions of, I need to get out of here. I need to survive. I'm a fugitive from the law of averages, one of my favorite quotes from World War II. And what's interesting is that even the people who were probably most responsible for the war, the people, Abraham Lincoln certainly seems to think that it's about slavery by 1864-65. Like I said, Northerners more and more seem to talk about slavery over the course of the war. Confederates, not so much. And after the war, this continues. After the war, Southern generals, Southern politicians, ex-Confederates vehemently argue that the war was not about slavery. And perhaps the most famous quote from all of them is Davis. Jefferson Davis, in his autobiography, The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, he states, "The truth remains intact and incontrovertible that the existence of African servitude was in no wise the cause of the conflict, but only an incident. To whatever extent the question of slavery may have as an occasion, it was far from being the cause." And he ultimately points back to political principles. He says it's about the Constitution, it's about states' rights. Well, I think any reading of the secession conventions would note that it's both. Any reading of the stated justifications for why slavery occurred, you can't divorce the two. Political principle. Why did the war happen? It was about politics. It was about the Constitution. It was about states' rights. It was about the economy. It was about an industrializing, more urban population in the North and a more agricultural, rural population in the South. It was about social differences. It was about it was about Northern populace differing views of democracy compared to that of the South. And it was about race. The Civil War was about slavery. You can't escape it. But it wasn't just about slavery. And it's important. What does this mean for us today? And that's the legacy part of this. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this as well, because history is malleable. History is fragile. History tends to conform to whatever you want it to be. If you want to study the Civil War and prove that it was just about slavery, you can do that. If you want to study the war and prove that it was just about the Constitution and states' rights, you can do that. If you want to prove that it was just about money, the sources are there. But as a historian, we can't be objective, but we can at least not be completely subjective. A true historical assessment needs to take all of these factors into account. We have to. It's the only way to truly do justice for the millions of men who chose to fight in the war, for the hundreds of thousands who died in the war, and for the millions who were set free because of the war. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. All right, so we have first question from Bill Friedman. Isn't it reasonable to think that Davis's minimizing slavery as a cause was owed to the disgust of the victors and their outrage against it? For example, that attitudes had changed and hardened.
Yes, I mean, what it sounds like you're suggesting is that Davis, what the Civil War established unequivocally was that slavery was immoral. I mean, you listen to Jefferson Davis and he's using the Bible, and unfortunately there's a lot in the Bible to justify slavery. So Southerners had long used the Old and New Testament to kind of justify why slavery had to exist. Well, the Civil War proves conclusively that it's disgusting, it's terrible, and it's got to go. And so Southerners after the war enter what's known as the lost cause, where they're basically trying to argue we lost, but that doesn't mean we were wrong. Well, it's easier to do that with a constitutional argument. It's easier to do that with a legal argument. It's easier to do that with a states' rights argument. By 1870s, you're absolutely right. Opinions had changed, morals had changed in some respects, and people viewed slavery as an absolute evil. And so you see very few Southerners. Some actually do. Some Southerners stand up in the, guys like Jubal Early will stand up in the 1870s and 1880s and go, slavery was great. Why did we get rid of it? But guys like Jefferson Davis tend to pivot back to the political argument because they know they're really not going to get much support playing the race card and the slavery card.
Okay, Chris Stant has a question. Why did the Confederacy not see the value of fighting the war in the West? Were they certain they would prevail? If not, why did they force the war?
The war in the West, so I'm assuming you're talking about, a lot of the war was about westward expansion. My high school history teacher, if you were to ask him what was the cause of the Civil War, he would say westward expansion, Mr. Hockey, westward expansion, Mr. Sodergren, westward expansion. Well, yeah, it really was about who gets to control westward expansion. This came up over Missouri, this comes up over Kansas, this comes up over Texas after the Mexican War. So really they were trying to secure rights to westward expansion. And the Confederacy believed They do actually fight the war in the West. There's fighting in New Mexico, Glorieta Pass, Valverde, New Mexico. These are battles. There's fighting in California. There's fighting in Colorado. The Confederates launch a major invasion of the West to try to lock that down. Really, they want California because California is full of gold. But yeah, they try to secure the Western states because that's part of their justification for fighting. The problem is, it's hard to fight wars out west. And also, if you're going to send all your troops out west, then George McClellan's going to march into downtown Richmond, and there goes your capital. So they don't really devote a lot of resources out west. They figure we'll get to the west eventually, but let's actually secure our independence first.
Okay, next question. Why do some Southerners continue to call the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression?
First of all, I have to admit I'm a Yankee through and through. I was born and raised in Illinois, the land of Lincoln. So obviously we get into this notion of the legacy of the war and why we still have this differing notion as to why I have gone down to places like Vicksburg, Atlanta, Charleston, Savannah, and given talks and lectures about this sort of thing, and I get a somewhat different response than I get in Vermont. It's cultural. It has a lot to do with how the war emerged in the end of the 19th, early 20th centuries. And really, today we talk about, oh, who should we honor? Should we honor this person's legacy? That, guess what? These aren't new debates. They've been occurring all the way back to the 1880s, 1890s, when you have the North Northern veterans kept calling it the war between the states. And Southern veterans kept calling it the War of Northern Aggression because they did not see themselves as the aggressors. They believed that if they had just been left alone, there wouldn't have been a war. That the North had basically picked a fight. That Lincoln had picked a fight, and so that's where it comes from. A lot of it also is to sort of paint yourself as the little guy, and the South was the little guy. The little guy in terms of they were outnumbered, they were outgunned, they were all sorts of things. So by painting the War of Northern Aggression, you project an image of being a victim. And so much about the Confederate veterans at the end of the 19th century was about victimhood, about the notion that we were right, martyrdom. But at the same, we were right, we lost, but that doesn't mean we weren't right. And so I think that's tied up in it.
Okay, next question. The Southern voice regarding slavery would say that it was a natural result of their inequality. Even in the yes of God. What is your sense of the Northern view regarding equality of races?
Yeah, let me see here. Yeah, I mean, there's this notion that Northerners weren't exactly progressive by modern standards. And this is sometimes pointed out by people who try to defend the Confederacy and say, yes, the Confederates had slaves, but Northerners didn't like African Americans either. And by and large, that is true. The Northern population was not exactly believing in integration. And Southerners sometimes said that Northerners, had the luxury of holding these lofty opinions because they're up there where there aren't African Americans, and the Confederates are down where there are African Americans. So I think it's kind of a false equivalency because, yes, Northerners did not necessarily support equality of the races, but that's not the same thing as owning slaves and being part of that whole system. So saying that somebody who maybe, is not supportive of equality is the same thing as the slave master who's whipping his slaves on a daily basis, once again, I think is a false equivalency. And Northerners, no, they weren't necessarily big fans of emancipation, but they got there. They got there a lot faster than the South did. And you see, obviously, resistance to emancipation in the South through Reconstruction, in the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and things like that. So Northerners are guilty of passivity of more than anything else. They are more guilty of of not really getting involved in trying to stop it. The abolitionists were loud, vocal, but not exactly majority. They were a minority. most Northerners really just didn't care one way or another when it came to slavery. Whereas if you look at the Southern population, there's one historian by the name of James McPherson wrote a great book called For Cause and Comrades, where he looks at why soldiers fought in the war. And he looks for soldiers talking about slavery in the Confederacy. And he finds only about 20% of soldiers actually mention slavery at all. But that entire 20% is in favor of it. In reviewing over 1,000 soldier accounts, he does not find a single Southern soldier speak out against slavery. You can find a lot of Northerners speaking out against slavery. So I think there is a difference there.
Okay. What were the percentages of West Point graduates that fought in the South versus the North?
Oh, wow. I just taught that today. If you give me a second to look up, I got the number right here. It's surprising, actually, because there were two different things. There's the West Point graduates, and then there is the actual Army officers. Very famously, a large chunk of serving Army officers resign their commissions and serve in the Confederacy. Well, there's a difference. The U.S. Army was not all West Point graduates at this point. It was still largely volunteers. So there weren't enough West Point graduates to fill all the officer slots. So as a result, you had a lot of non-West Point graduates. So here's the numbers here, right here. Here we go. All right. Of West Point graduates who were in the Army at the start of the war from Confederate states, 168 went south, 162 went north. So 51% of West Point graduates in the U.S. Army at the start of the war secede. That's not bad. I mean, that's not good when you have half your Army officers saying we're leaving, but considering that you had many officers from Confederate states, Winfield Scott, the General-in-Chief, George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, you had all sorts of Southern-born officers who stay loyal to the Union. That's pretty impressive. And that suggests that maybe West Point was creating a national identity, that the 49% of Southern-born West Point officers saw themselves as American first, state second. Now, obviously, the major exception to this, Robert E. Lee.
Which leads us to this next question. Any insights into the personal views concerning slavery held by Robert E. Lee? Carlos says that he read a book containing his letters to his sons written during the course of the war, and the subject of slavery seemed to be totally absent.
Yeah, I don't know if this is the book you're thinking of, but there's a great book called by Elizabeth Brown Pryor called, I think, Reading the Man, The Letters of Robert E. Lee, and she got unprecedented access to his private letters. No, he doesn't talk about it that much during the war. He talks a lot about it in the 1850s, and he is a slave owner in the war. But no, he doesn't talk that much about it, and that's probably not one of the reasons why he's fighting. But it doesn't really change the fact that he does own slaves. He's making money from slavery, and he does not want to see it end. And that is something he makes repeatedly clear across his course of career. He does not really want to end slavery. They talk about, oh, well, he was planning to free his slaves. He believed in emancipation. Yes, he did talk about that, but he never did it. And he certainly was not going to lose money doing it. He chose to keep making money. He could have freed his slaves any time. He just would have gone deeply into debt. And he chose to not go into debt and keep his slaves. So no, I don't think slavery is a big reason why Lee serves in the war. And he certainly doesn't talk about it a lot during the war, but it's a part of his life, just like it's a part of the Southern life. And, even if he's not talking about it, it's, his wife will see to it that their slaves are removed from Arlington before it is occupied by Union forces. So.
Okay. Did foreign observers say what they thought caused the war? For example, did British reporters rank slavery as a top cause of the war?
Depends who you ask. There were two types of observers. There were the reporters, who, strangely enough, didn't really care all that much. A lot of the Europeans viewed the Civil War as, oh, that's nice. Those colonials are getting into trouble again. You know, they really kind of saw us as a one-off, and they also kind of saw this is what happens with republics, is they fall apart. See, we told you, monarchies are the way to go. The military observers, though, because the British Army, the French Army, the Prussian Army, the Russian Army, they all send observers, and they look at both sides. And they write some very good books offering their accounts as to what they see. And what they see is they're mostly hanging out with the soldiers. And they kind of see the same thing I was just telling you, is the soldiers don't really care about the big stuff, but they're devoted to their country. And so if you read the accounts, they're not, the foreign observers aren't talking about slavery. The reporters do. The reporters talk a lot about slavery, partly because it was a big deal, at least to Britain and France, because the slaves made the cotton that they needed for the textile factories in Britain and France. So the future of slavery, sorry to be a bit of a cynic here, but the future of slavery basically meant how much our stuff is going to cost to the British and the French. If slavery goes away, that means our the price is going to go up. And so, I mean, that's not good, but at the same time, they're a foreign country. They're on the other side of the Atlantic, so that's their opinion. But the military observers are fascinating guys, and they mostly come back to this notion of patriotism, duty, and honor that they see. Maybe that's because they're looking for it, because that's the reasons why they serve. But yeah.
All right. This question, I have actually two-part question, but I'll start with the first question from Ellen. And she does say this is an excellent presentation. Thank you. Could you comment a bit more on the economic and cultural aspects? For example, the cultural differences between Northern and Southern values.
Yeah. Thank you, and I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation. And I'm always happy to do these sorts of things. Economically, you got to keep in mind that North and South have been going in different directions since colonial days. Founding a Jamestown colony. Jamestown was founded for a simple reason: to make money. In fact, the first boat that went to Jamestown when it settled in 1609 was not necessarily farming equipment. It was filled with shovels and pickaxes because they thought they'd be mining for gold. I've been down on the James River. I've been to Virginia. There's not a lot of gold down there, and there wasn't 300, 400 years ago. But even when Jamestown does get off the ground, it's tobacco. And most of the southern colonies had been founded for economic reasons: to grow tobacco, to grow rice, to grow indigo, the Tidewater regions, and eventually, by the time of the Civil War, to grow cotton. And so the southern economy was what we call a monoculture. It was devoted towards the cash crop. 70% of everything grown in the South was either cotton or tobacco. You can't eat cotton or tobacco. Well, I'll leave it to you to decide whether or not you can, but I wouldn't recommend it. Whereas in the North goes in a different direction. You see Massachusetts. Massachusetts, that's not founded exclusively for money. It's founded on principle. It's founded on ideology. You see Pennsylvania, founded on ideology. You see Maryland, founded as a haven for Catholics. Now, obviously, they're gonna start farms. They're going to grow crops and try to make money. It's the American dream. But this gets to that twin tension in American history, where we want to make money, but we also want to be principled. And sometimes those don't coincide. And so I don't want to say that the Southerners were kind of greedy and all about making money, but their system was more geared towards agriculturally supporting a system that fed this cash crop economy. Whereas the Northern economy, well, they got their own flaws. Industrialization is not exactly a friendly thing to wage labor, but at the same time, there was more opportunity for small landowners to basically gain a little plot of earth to call their own. Whereas Jefferson Davis in Mississippi owns something like 50 to 60,000 acres, most of the land in the north is owned 40, 60 acres. small farmers. And so what this leads is to an economic distinction, but also a cultural one. The idea that in many ways, the slave economy creates an almost feudal system. The plantation owner is the lord and the slaves are their serfs. That's not what you see with the independent landowners in the North, where they are the lord of their own manor. They're the lord of these 60 acres. And nobody can take it away from them. And that creates a different mentality. And so not only economically does it create a different system, it just creates a different vision of things. And so, I mean, you can go all the way back. You can go back to the colonial period. You know, there's all sorts of Civil War historians who ask, where should we start? And I ask this when I teach my Civil War class. Where should we start the Civil War? Should we start in 1860, 1854, 1850, 1820, 1776, 1676, Bacon's Rebellion, by the way, 1609, 1492, where do we start the American Civil War? You can make an argument for any of it, but yeah, the deeper stuff had been bubbling for a while, leading to this divide between North and South.
Ellen's second part question, could the war have been avoided had the fire eaters of the South been more willing to accept some of the many compromises that were attempted?
Yeah, yes. And this is, you have both sides basically blaming radical minorities for steering them down violent paths. Sound familiar? You have Northerners basically saying it's guys like John C. Calhoun, it's the very pro-slavery people who just won't listen to reason, won't realize that, okay, slavery is a part of our system, but we can restrict it, right? We can control it, right? We can regulate it, right? And then you have Southerners saying, you know, we're trying to negotiate with you people, but it's those abolitionists. John Brown goes in and kills a bunch of people at Harper's Ferry. And, so you have Southerners basically saying it's the radical abolitionists who are hijacking this conversation. We can't work with the Northerners as long as the abolitionists have a voice. And as a result, it gives both sides an excuse not to talk, because they can basically blame the radical groups among each other and say, well, as long as you support them, I'm not going to talk to you. And so, yes, there was a compromise here. There was a breakdown of communication. In terms of the Southerners, they are the ones who really walk away from the table. So a lot of it does fall on them because, and you saw it in my presentation, you see the Southern states going, what's the point of talking anymore? You're not listening. You're not listening. So we're not going to talk to you anymore.
All right. Let's see. This is from John Delano. According to Shelby Foote, a Confederate soldier was once asked by a Union soldier why he was fighting. The Confederate soldier replied, because you're down here. That reply seems consistent with the view of many here in Virginia.
Yeah. Yeah. And I am not going to be the one to argue with Shelby Foote. And yeah, I remember, as a kid, I watched the Ken Burns series over and over again. And I remember that segment. And yes, so much of in my head, whenever I'm hearing Civil War history, I'm hearing Shelby Foote speak it. Yes, and that is a good explanation. But I think that also kind of ties back to what I was saying. Their country was their state. The idea of patriotism was more of a local concern for them. So they weren't thinking about fighting for the Stars and Stripes. They were thinking about fighting for their county, for their parish, for their community. So yeah, absolutely. And it was easier for Southerners. It was easier for Confederates to say, I'm fighting because you're down here, because the Northerners were the aggressors in many respects because they were invading. In order to defeat the South, they had to cross the Mason-Dixon line. And as a result, it was easier for Confederates to say, I'm just doing this because I'm protecting my home. And they had a more legitimate argument for doing that. But keep in mind, that's not necessarily why they join up, because a lot of guys join up before a single Union soldier crosses any sort of state boundary. So a lot of these guys are already anticipating an invasion, or they're just anticipating fighting for a country that may or may not exist.
I think we'll make this our final question. I think it's a good one to end on. Do you see any parallels to today's political divisions? For example, no faith in the government.
Yeah, obviously I've been hinting at that. And the answer actually, look, I do have faith. And what I keep trying to tell my students and what I keep trying to tell my friends and my family is to kind of step back from the ledge and things. So much of today is partisan. We are going through a terrible pandemic. Our economy is in dire straits. This is a difficult time for our country, but it's not the worst. I study the Civil War. I've seen it when things truly fall apart. People say, oh, this is the most important election. Well, it's the most important election because we have a say in it, because we can still vote and affect its outcome. We can't affect the outcome of the 1860 election. It's locked in. And if you look at the outcome of that election, 1860 is probably the most important presidential election in our history, because look what happened. And things fell apart. People lost faith in the political process. Can that happen again? Absolutely. Will it happen again? I'm a historian. I'm not a prognosticator, sorry, but personally, I don't think so. I don't think we've reached that point. There were a variety of circumstances that came together in 1860 that made the outcome inevitable. I truly believe that the situation we find ourselves in is not inevitable, that we still have agency, that overwhelmingly, I think people do have faith in this country, and I'm trying not to be a cynic about what's going to happen, partly because, going back to history one more time, we've made it. We've made it this far. As I tell my students, no president has destroyed the United States yet. The closest might have been Abraham Lincoln, but no president has done it yet. So we have an almost unparalleled track record of presidents not destroying this country. So I'm going to put faith in the scoreboard and believe that no matter the outcome of this current cycle, no matter how things turn out one way or another, we're still going to be standing here on the other end of it.
Well, I'm not alone in saying this. Thank you for a well-researched presentation. This was great, and I want to thank everyone for joining us here. Please go to our website and check out our upcoming programs, and I'll hope to see you all on Zoom.
Thank you all for being here for this. I'm always happy to talk about the Civil War. If you ever want to reach out to me, my email address is on the Norwich site. I'm happy to talk about it, but thank you all for your time. Thank you to Gloria. Thank you to the Green Mountain Academy. It's been a great experience.
And we'd love to have you back. So
always
have a good night, everyone.
Good night.